The ultimatum arrived without ceremony, a cold transmission translated into plain language and broadcast across every human network, stating that the Valoran Concord demanded humanity's unconditional surrender within 7 standard days or face planetary compliance. And across Earth, the reaction was not panic, but a quiet tightening of focus as governments convened emergency sessions. Admirals rerouted fleets, and analysts replayed the message frame by frame, noting the casual contempt in the alien envoy's tone as he described humans as a regional inconvenience that had outlived its usefulness, while on Luna Vice Admiral Daniel Crowe listened in silence, his lined face revealing nothing as aides whispered casualty projections that assumed defeat. Projections he dismissed with a raised hand because he had already authorized contingency protocols written decades earlier when humanity first realized the galaxy was not empty, and on Mars Governor Alicia Moreno addressed the Colonial Assembly with a calm promise that evacuation was unnecessary, that preparations were already underway, and that the Concord had misunderstood a species that learned survival under constant pressure, a misunderstanding mirrored aboard the Valoran flagship, where strategist Krelf assessed human transmissions as chaotic noise and assured the Council that a week was generous for a species still divided by borders, never considering that the noise was deliberate misdirection as human cyber units seeded false debates and exaggerated protests to sell the illusion of paralysis, while in hidden shipyards beyond Saturn engineers accelerated final assembly of vessels that had never appeared on any public registry. Ships designed not for patrol, but for decisive engagements using doctrines born from centuries of asymmetric warfare. And as Day 1 turned into Day 2, the Concord observers reported no visible capitulation, which amused them, interpreting restraint as fear. While on Earth, Captain Laura Bennett oversaw live fire drills in the Pacific, crews practicing coordinated strikes with precision that came from years of joint exercises kept secret under civilian covers, and scientists like Dr. Ethan Cole finalized adjustments to gravitic dampeners that would allow human ships to maneuver inside energy fields thought impassable, a fact the Concord considered immutable law. And when Day 3 dawned, the Alien Council debated whether to shorten the deadline, but decided against it, confident that starvation and terror would soon force surrender, unaware that humanity had long planned for sieges on a planetary scale, stockpiling resources and dispersing industry, and in a quiet room beneath Denver President Marcus Hale addressed the world with measured words, acknowledging the threat and promising resolve without boasting, because humanity had learned that silence unnerved enemies more than bravado, and that night human fleets began to move under emissions control, slipping through jump points mapped only by experimental probes, while Valoran pickets saw nothing and reported nothing, and by day for the Concord's patience thinned as human markets stabilized instead of collapsing, their expected social fracture failing to appear, leading strategist Krell to authorize a demonstration strike on an uninhabited moon to remind humanity of power, a strike that obliterated rock and sent a warning signal that humans publicly mourned as a tragedy while privately logging every energy signature and timing pattern. Information fed into tactical models that adjusted firing solutions, and on Day 5, Admiral Crowe briefed task force commanders with simple directive to hold until the clock expired, to let the Concord commit fully to belief that humans would kneel because overconfidence was the most reliable weakness. And among the Valorans, junior officers questioned why the humans had not responded, only to be silenced by elders who recited historical precedents of lesser species folding under pressure, never imagining that humanity's history was a catalog of refusing ultimatums. And as Day 6 began, human diplomats requested a final channel, transmitting a single sentence that asked for clarification on surrender terms, a message that sent ripples of satisfaction to the Concord as they prepared a formal response, unaware that the request was timed to synchronize clocks and confirm network access, opening microseconds of vulnerability that human cyber teams exploited to map command hierarchies, and when the response came with elaborate conditions and thinly veiled insults, it was logged, acknowledged, and archived, the last communication before silence fell again, and as the final day ticked down, Earth did not beg, did not riot, did not flee. It prepared. Cities dimmed lights, fleets aligned vectors, and soldiers across worlds checked equipment with ritual calm, knowing that when the week ended, the Concord would learn that regret could be measured in seconds, and that humanity had never intended to surrender at all. When the seventh day ended, the Valoran Concord initiated its compliance countdown with ceremonial precision, believing the final hours would break human resolve. And across their command network's confidence hardened into doctrine as strategist Krelf authorized Operation Final Silence, a plan refined against dozens of weaker civilizations. Yet the moment the deadline expired, nothing happened in human space. No surrender signal. No frantic negotiations. Only a sudden and total drop in detectable emissions that confused Concord sensors, interpreted first as technical failure, and then as evidence of collapse, prompting Krell to order forward elements to advance and secure key systems, a decision that committed their fleets into carefully prepared kill zones mapped years earlier by human deep-range scouts. And as Valoran cruisers emerged from jump near the outer colonies, they encountered what appeared to be abandoned infrastructure, silent stations drifting cold, which reinforced their belief that humanity had fled inward, never realizing the stations were bait fitted with passive sensors and quantum relays feeding live data to Admiral Crow's command ship hidden beyond normal detection. And when the first Valoran patrol wing vanished without transmitting a distress call, Krell dismissed it as navigational error, unaware that Captain Laura Bennett's task group had executed a zero-emission ambush using relativistic projectiles that left no warning signature, attacked humans, had refined specifically to counter species relying on energy-based detection, and as reports of missing units accumulated, the Concord's confidence shifted into irritation rather than fear, leading them to deploy heavier forces with orders to engage decisively, which only deepened the trap as human fleets struck supply tenders and command relays instead of frontline warships, severing coordination and forcing Valoran captains to operate independently for the first time in their history. And on, Earth President Hale addressed the population again, confirming that hostilities had begun and urging calm, his steady tone masking the scale of the operation unfolding light years away, while Dr. Ethan Cole monitored real-time telemetry showing human ships maneuvering inside gravitic envelopes thought to be lethal, a breakthrough that allowed them to strike from angles Valoran gunners could not track. And aboard a damaged Concord cruiser, junior officers argued over conflicting sensor data, unable to reconcile the absence of visible enemies with the steady destruction of their escorts, leading to the first cracks in Valoran doctrine as captains hesitated, a hesitation Admiral Crow had counted on when he authorized Phase 2, the reveal, which began with a coordinated transmission broadcast across Concord military channels. Not a threat or boast, but a clear statement that the ultimatum had been rejected, followed immediately by precise strikes that disabled flagships without destroying them, leaving crews alive to witness the failure of their assumptions. And as Krelf watched status icons wink out across the tactical display, he felt something unfamiliar. Not panic, but disbelief. The slow realization that humanity had spent the week not deciding whether to surrender, but deciding how much mercy to show. And while Valoran forces reeled from the opening hours of combat, human commanders maintained discipline, refusing to pursue fleeing units and instead consolidating control of jump points, ensuring the Concord could not retreat or reinforce, a strategic choice rooted in human history, where wars were ended by controlling movement rather than chasing enemies. And by the time the first Valoran world received fragment reports of the disaster, the narrative of human weakness had already collapsed, replaced by a growing dread as the galaxy began to understand that the 1 week given to humanity had been a gift, not a threat, and that every second since had been borrowed time. As the first engagement spread across Concord controlled space, the illusion of Valoran superiority unraveled faster than their admirals could contain, because humanity did not fight as a single monolithic fleet, but as a distributed intelligence, hundreds of independent task groups executing aligned objectives without waiting for centralized commands, a concept that baffled Valoran officers conditioned to rigid hierarchies, and as damaged cruisers limped away broadcasting fragmented warnings. Those signals were drowned out by Concord sensors who feared panic more than defeat. Yet suppression could not erase the reality experienced by frontline crews who watched human ships appear inside exclusion zones, strike with mechanical precision, and vanish before a turn fire could lock. And aboard one such cruiser, Valoran captain named Threx ordered a full power scan despite doctrine forbidding it, only to watch his own sensor surge expose his vessel to a kinetic strike that tore through the command deck without an explosion, leaving silence and drifting debris, an event logged by human analysts as confirmation that Valoran reactions follow predictable stress patterns, while Admiral Crow authorized expansion of operations towards secondary systems not to conquer, but to demonstrate reach, ensuring that every Concord governor would learn of human capability from personal experience rather than official statements. And on a distant mining world, human Marines, led by Colonel Nathan Brooks, executed the first boarding action of the war, breaching a Valoran garrison with non-lethal suppression rounds and taking prisoners who expected execution but were instead restrained, treated, and questioned, an act that spread confusion through Concord ranks as rumors circulated that humans fought without ritual cruelty, undermining centuries of fear-based compliance. And Dr. Cole's team confirmed another advantage as captured Valoran technology proved incompatible with rapid adaptation, meaning the Concord could not easily learn from human methods, even as humans absorbed alien systems into their tactical simulations, accelerating an already widening gap. And as days turned into weeks without a decisive Valoran victory, the Concord Council convened an emergency session where Krell faced open dissent, junior strategists presenting data that contradicted long-held assumptions about human psychology and industrial limits, arguments dismissed until a human strike disabled the Council's own orbital defense grid without firing a shot, exploiting a maintenance cycle no Valoran had ever questioned, forcing the Council to relocate mid-session, an indignity that shattered confidence and exposed leadership fractures, while on-Earth public life continued under controlled conditions, factories running, schools adapting schedules, the population informed enough to understand stakes but shielded from operational details, a balance struck deliberately to prevent fear from becoming interference. And as President Hale met with allied leaders from non-Concord species seeking reassurance, he offered neither threats nor promises, only stating that humanity sought stability, not domination, a statement broadcast galaxy-wide that contrasted sharply with the Concord's original ultimatum. And among neutral worlds, that contrast mattered as trade routes quietly shifted and observers began sharing intelligence with human channels, sensing where power was truly moving, and within Valoran space, isolated commanders attempted counterattacks using overwhelming force at single points, only to find human fleets dispersing and reassembling elsewhere, turning mass into liability. And as losses mounted, Krell authorized escalation protocols long considered theoretical, orders to deploy weapons banned even within Concord law, a decision that would later define the war, because humanity had anticipated it. And Admiral Crow received confirmation that escalation thresholds were crossed, triggering contingencies written in the quiet years when surrender had never been an option. And across the galaxy, the understanding grew that the week given to humanity had not delayed war, but revealed who truly understood it. The Concord's decision to escalate marked a moment when the conflict shifted from calculated dominance to existential fear, because the forbidden weapons they unleashed were designed to terrify populations into submission rather than defeat fleets. And when Valoran Task Force deployed a stellar shear device near a lightly populated human frontier system, the intent was clear: to demonstrate that humanity's worlds are fragile. Yet the device failed catastrophically as its containment field, destabilized under unexpected gravitational interference. A failure later traced to Dr. Cole's earlier adjustments propagating through space-time in ways Valoran science had never modeled, turning the weapon inward and erasing the task force that carried it, an event witnessed by human long-range sensors and quietly logged as proof that Concord escalation only accelerated their own collapse. And when news of the loss reached the Valoran Council, the chamber dissolved into accusation and panic. Elders blaming Krell while he defended the choices necessary, even as evidence mounted that humanity had predicted every move. And Admiral Crow seized the initiative not by striking the Concord capital, but by executing a system-wide broadcast showing captured Valoran officers, confirming humane treatment and clear communication, undermining the narrative of human savagery that had justified Concord rule. And across subject worlds, unrest ignited as populations realized the enforcers fear were neither invincible nor benevolent, while human fleets continued their methodical advance, dismantling logistics, freeing prisoners, and withdrawing before occupation could bog them down, a rhythm of warfare refined through centuries of human conflict, where victory meant breaking the enemy's ability to continue rather than claiming territory. And Colonel Brooks' Marines became symbols across the frontier, disciplined units that arrived, neutralized threats, restored basic services, and departed, leaving behind the idea that resistance was possible. And as neutral species began openly denying Concord access to ports and refueling stations, the strategic map shifted dramatically, forcing Valoran commanders into desperate gambits that exposed their remaining forces. And in one such engagement, Captain Bennett's task group baited a Concord dread formation into a gravity well where human ships operated effortlessly, while Valoran vessels struggled, resulting in a decisive defeat that left survivors broadcasting pleas rather than threats. And on Earth, President Hale addressed the world once more, confirming that the war was expanding but emphasizing that humanity would not retaliate against civilians, a statement that resonated beyond human space and contrasted sharply with Concord doctrine. And within the Valoran hierarchy, that contrast proved corrosive as officers questioned orders that now seemed less about security and more about pride, leading to delays, miscommunications, and defections. And when Krell finally authorized a full withdrawal to consolidate defenses around the capital, he discovered too late that humanity had never intended a direct assault, because the capital was already isolated, its supply chain severed, its subject worlds in revolt, and its fleets depleted. And as human analysts assessed the situation, they concluded that the Concord had already lost, not because of a single battle, but because the week they had given humanity had revealed a fundamental truth: that power built on fear collapses quickly when faced with a species that understands patience, coordination, and the cost of surrender. And across the galaxy, the lesson spread that the regret of those 7 days would echo far longer than the war itself. As the Concord's withdrawal collapsed into the sword of the galaxy, enter a phase of quiet transformation that unfolded alongside the remaining battles. Because humanity understood that wars were decided as much by perception as by firepower, and Admiral Crow directed information operations with the same care as fleet movements, releasing verified records of Concord decisions, ultimatums, and sensor losses to neutral networks, allowing facts to speak without commentary. And those facts traveled faster than fleets as subject species began coordinating resistance, not under human command, but inspired by the demonstration that the Concord could be opposed and survived. And within Valoran, space governors found themselves cut off from central authority, forced to choose between enforcing orders with dwindling resources or negotiating local stability, choices that fractured the Empire along lines it had long suppressed, while Captain Bennett led patrols that intercepted fleeing Concord, officials attempting to escape justice, capturing them without spectacle and transferring them to neutral courts, a deliberate act meant to signal that humanity sought accountability rather than extermination. And on Earth, Dr. Cole briefed international leaders on the long-term implications of the gravitic breakthroughs, emphasizing restraint and shared oversight to prevent an armed spiral, a message that contrasted sharply with Concord's secrecy and further strengthened human credibility. And as weeks passed without a decisive final battle, Krell attempted to reassert control by consolidating remaining fleets around symbolic locations, issuing grand declarations that no longer convinced even his own officers. And when a senior Valoran admiral defected publicly, confirming systemic failures and offering to negotiate ceasefire terms, the psychological blow exceeded any battlefield loss, because it validated every doubt spreading through Concord ranks, and Admiral Crow accepted the defection not as a trophy but as an opportunity, using the information provided to map safe corridors for civilian traffic and prevent further humanitarian crises, reinforcing the pattern that human strategy prioritized ending the war cleanly. And among human populations, fatigue set in, but panic never did, because the conflict had been framed not as survival by desperation, but as defense by preparation, a narrative reinforced by steady governance and transparent communication. And as neutral species formed provisional councils to discuss post-Concord security frameworks. Humanity participated without dominance, offering logistics and mediation rather than control, a posture that confused those who expected conquest. And within the Valoran capital, the council chamber sat half empty as members argued over surrender terms, reparations, and personal liability, arguments interrupted by reports that another subject system had declared independence without resistance. And as the map continued to change, analysts concluded that the war had effectively ended the moment the ultimatum expired. Everything since merely the unraveling of a structure that could not withstand a species that treated time as a weapon. And across the galaxy, the understanding deepened that the regret felt by the Concord was not only for the defeat they suffered, but for the opportunity they had given humanity to demonstrate a different model of power, one built on resolve, coordination, and a refusal to be rushed into mistakes. By the time the Concord formally requested mediated talks, the war had entered its final psychological phase, because the Valoran leadership was no longer negotiating from strength, but from the need to preserve what little legitimacy remained, and humanity understood that pressing too hard would only prolong instability. So Admiral Crowe accepted talks under strict conditions that prioritized ceasefire enforcement, civilian protection, and verification rather than symbolic surrender, a framework that surprised Valoran envoys accustomed to rituals of dominance. And as negotiations opened on a neutral station, representatives from former Concord subject worlds were invited to observe, a decision that stripped the Valorans of their exclusive authority and forced them to confront the consequences of centuries of imposed silence. While President Hale authorized the release of additional archives documenting humanity's initial restraint during the ultimatum week, showing that at multiple points humans could have preemptively struck, but chose not to, a revelation that reframed the entire conflict as one where aggression had been a choice made solely by the Concord, and within Valoran society that narrative triggered widespread unrest as citizens questioned why their leaders had risked annihilation over an assumption of superiority, and as the talks progressed, Krelth appeared increasingly isolated, his earlier confidence replaced by rigid defensiveness, until confronted with evidence that several fleet commanders had already accepted localized ceasefires without authorization, effectively ending organized resistance, and Colonel Brooks' Marines shifted from combat roles to stabilization support, assisting local authorities in securing infrastructure and preventing reprisals, actions that further differentiated humanity's conduct from the terror tactics the Concord had relied upon, and Dr. Cole's team worked with neutral scientists to ensure that damaged stellar systems were stabilized, preventing cascading disasters from failed Concord weapons, an effort that saved lives across species lines and quietly reinforced humanity's reputation as a long-term actor rather than a transient conqueror. And as days of talk stretched into weeks, the shape of a post-Concord order began to emerge, one defined less by a single dominant power and more by shared security guarantees, with humanity positioned not as ruler but as anchor, a role earned not by proclamation, but by consistent behavior under pressure. And when Krell finally resigned during a closed session, the news leaked within hours, confirming what many already believed, that the Concord had lost not because its fleets were destroyed, but because its worldview could not adapt. And as a mediated agreement was finalized, it included provisions that barred ultimatums backed by force, a clause written explicitly in response to the 7-day demand that had started the war, and across the galaxy, historians began marking that ultimatum not as a moment of human defiance alone, but as the instant when the balance of power shifted irreversibly, because humanity had demonstrated that patience, preparation, and unity could dismantle an empire without seeking to replace it, and the regret felt by the Concord had evolved from anger into a quiet, enduring understanding that the week they had given humanity had allowed a different future to take shape, one they could no longer control. In the aftermath of the agreement, the galaxy entered a period of uneasy adjustment as systems long bound by fear tested the reality of autonomy, and humanity moved carefully, aware that sudden absence of authority could be as dangerous as oppression. So Admiral Crowe established joint monitoring groups composed of human officers and representatives from former Concord worlds to ensure ceasefire compliance and prevent power vacuums, a slow process that frustrated those who wanted immediate resolution but prevented the spiral of retaliatory violence that had followed past imperial collapses. And on Earth, President Hale resisted calls for celebration, framing the outcome not as victory but as responsibility, reminding the population that demonstrating strength without restraint would undo everything achieved, a message echoed by Captain Bennett when addressing crews rotated home, emphasizing that discipline after combat mattered as much as courage during it. And as trade routes reopened under new protocols, economies began to stabilize, revealing how deeply the Concord's coercive systems had distorted development, while Dr. Cole coordinated scientific exchanges that allowed former subject species to access knowledge long restricted, accelerating recovery and building interdependence that made renewed domination less likely. And within Valoran society, the shock of defeat gave way to introspection as citizens confronted archives, revealing how information had been manipulated, leading to internal reforms that dismantled the structures enabling unilateral ultimatums. And although resentment lingered, it lacked the unity required for renewed aggression, because the myth of invincibility had been irreparably broken, and across neutral systems, military academies revised doctrines, studying the conflict not for tactics alone, but for the strategic use of time, deception, and restraint, acknowledging that humanity's greatest advantage had not been technology, but the ability to coordinate diverse actors without forcing uniformity. And as months passed without renewed hostilities, confidence grew that the war had truly ended, not frozen. And when a commemorative council convened to codify new interstellar norms, the opening address referenced the 7-day ultimatum explicitly, noting that it failed because it assumed compliance was inevitable, an assumption the galaxy could no longer afford. And among human veterans, a memory of those days remained. Vivid not as glory, but as confirmation of a long-held belief that preparation was an ethical obligation because it reduced the need for desperation. And as humanity resumed exploration beyond the former Concord frontier, it did so with escorts and observers rather than conquerors, signaling that the lesson learned was not that strength justified dominance, but that it imposed restraint. And throughout the galaxy, the phrase "one week" became shorthand for the danger of arrogance, a reminder that underestimating a patient species could reshape history, and that regret, once earned, could outlast fleets, councils, and empires alike. Years after the ultimatum, the conflict was no longer measured in battles or treaties, but in the quiet absence of fear that had once shaped the galaxy, because the structures that replaced the Concord were built deliberately slow, favoring verification over trust and shared oversight over command, principles humanity had insisted upon even when it could have dictated terms. And Admiral Crowe retired without ceremony, leaving behind doctrine studied rather than statues raised, while President Hale declined efforts to name the new security framework after Earth, insisting it belonged to all who upheld it, and Captain Bennett took command of a joint patrol fleet composed of crews from multiple species, a living symbol of the shift from enforced order to cooperative stability. And Dr. Cole continued his work ensuring that the technologies revealed during the war were bounded by agreements that prevented their misuse, understanding that power unrestrained would recreate the very conditions humanity had opposed. And within Valoran society, the memory of Krelta's ultimatum became a cautionary lesson taught openly, no longer hidden or justified, illustrating how certainty without understanding could undo generations of dominance. And as former subject worlds rebuilt, they did so with uneven speed, but shared confidence that no single voice could again issue a countdown backed by annihilation. And historians across systems eventually agreed that the war's defining moment was not the first strike or the last negotiation, but the silence that followed the expired deadline, when humanity chose action over panic and preparation over submission. And that choice reshaped expectations across the stars, proving that patience could be strategic, restraint could be powerful, and unity could emerge without conquest. And as new civilizations made first contact, they did so aware of the story, aware that ultimatums carried consequences, and aware that humanity's response had not been fueled by rage but by resolve. And in that understanding, the galaxy found a measure of lasting stability, one born from the regret of a week that taught every power watching that time, when offered to prepared species, could become the most decisive weapon of all